Hey, it's Soul with news, opinions, and analyses. And let's start with a question. Do you miss buffs? And by buffs, I mean the former, almost mandatory buffs that raiders have gotta have, otherwise they're hurting their performance. How about debuffs? Sunder armor, or that thing that increases magic damage taken, maybe? Whatever that is. The removal of debuffs, and now with Legion buffs, is just another one of the many steps Blizzard has taken over the years as part of the ability pruning of classes and specs. The debate over these and other changes has been pretty loud. On one extreme, players understand the need for change and evolution to occur with the game. Old systems inevitably have to make room for fresh ideas, paradigm shifts, and reiteration. On the other side is the accusation that the game is being dumbed down. The game is on a slippery slope that'll lead to WoW being pushed onto consoles or turned into a MOBA or something. Personally, I'm somewhere in the middle. Typical, right? I think ability bloat is real. New skills and ideas shouldn't be hamstrung by old concepts started over a decade ago. At the same time, I don't know if the paradigm of pushing class fantasy should mean rewriting a whole class or spec. About everything I say in this piece is going to be an opinion meant to get you to understand and either reinforce your own, hopefully valid opinions, or question your beliefs. Whatever your stance is, I want to talk about an old saying whose influence has been affecting WoW for years. It's probably at the core of why buffs are all but gone now. Bring the player, not the class. The origins of this quote were trumpeted by a designer named Ghostcrawler and was a centerpiece of class design during Wrath of the Lich King. In the past, among the raiding community, class stacking was a problem due to the more creative approaches players took to achieve their goals. From soulstoning an entire raid to chaining bloodlust, changes had to be made to prevent scenarios where one class utility was so powerful that it fundamentally altered gameplay strategy. Steps had to be made to discourage players from rolling classes or specs that normally they wouldn't want to. The philosophy was very broad and covered a number of areas including buffs and debuffs as well as raid cooldowns, and my analysis won't go much further than this. The goal was to make the idea of raid composition, the managing of individual class contributions, a little bit less restrictive. Where bloodlust or heroism was once restricted to a single class is today shared by multiple classes. In a way, this makes sense, and there hasn't been a lot of opposition to this change. One of the most powerful cooldowns in the game would be sorely missed if your team was missing a shaman. Not everyone wants to play as a shaman, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that everyone likes having bloodlust available. Other buffs and debuffs were pretty much invented solely to satisfy the design approach. Armor debuffs, mana replenishment, and attack power auras were shared among classes and balanced in such a way that it was likely to have most, if not all, the debuffs and buffs required for PvE content. Well, maybe it wasn't guaranteed due to the raid size, but it was likely. The approach was mostly successful, but not perfect. Class stacking continues, but this is more due to the raw performance of a particular class or spec at the time, and some of these scenarios are pretty extreme, mostly seen towards the bleeding edge of raid content. Up until Warlords of Draenor, it was a typical thing for me as a raid leader to, at the start of each raid night, hop onto MMO Champion's raid comp tool and plug my team in. It'd tell me what I'm missing, and if I had to, I'd tell someone to switch to a different class or spec, so there'd be as few gaps as possible. As a raid lead, there was a certain enjoyment to the meta in group building. It's another layer of preparedness on top of having your gear repaired and enchanted, your flasks and potions and food ready, and that sort of stuff. I just want my team prepared for battle. But as a raid lead, I had to understand what it was to be led as well. It didn't feel too good to tell someone that they couldn't bring their class or spec that they enjoyed playing, and instead bring whatever was most beneficial for the team. There's a sort of pressure on that person who now risks disappointing their team with an unoptimized composition. If I didn't ask them to switch, if I myself brought the player and not the class, if we didn't execute on our goals that night, then it'd be my fault for not making the tough call. Worse still were situations where I'd bring one person and bench another for those reasons. It is the reality of progressive raiding, but it doesn't have to feel good, and that reality didn't have to be set in stone, as evidenced by these changes. Once Warlords content was released, raid debuffs were all but thrown out. I think there was a reason for this. With Warlords was the full adoption of flexible raid technology, the ability to scale a raid between 10 and 30 players. The strategy of filling out a comp was nearly trivialized by this change. Missing a buff? That's no problem, fill it out. You just need to get one more person. No one had to be pushed out, which was great, but in a way it didn't put debuffs or even buffs into question at this point. Everything would be covered as long as we threw enough people into the group. If it's always assumed that passive buffs and debuffs were available, why have them at all? Whether or not this was intended, Warlord's raiding had less to worry about regarding raid composition. Bring me my buffs, a Bloodlust, a Battle Res, and maybe a Warlock summon, and we're left with the range and melee distribution, maybe tier token distribution as well if you're not using personal loot. Instead of making sure the attack power and armor debuff was applied, today's raid synergy relies more on the individual utility each class brings. Okay, well that was always there, but they became a lot more prominent by default. A hunter's mobility, for example, a paladin's blessing, a druid's stampeding roar, smoke bombs, that sort of stuff. The meta of group building started pushing away from the passive buffs and debuffs the classes brought, and more on the execution of active skills that were exclusive to a class. Before, it might have felt good to know that your debuff or your buff was helping the team succeed, but that's kind of an afterthought compared to that clutch vampiric embrace, the speed boost, or that really well-timed burst AoE. In Legion, passive buffs are mostly gone, limited to a few abilities here and there. In place of buffs, Blizzard is trying to celebrate the individual contributions of each player with unique cooldowns and other utility skills. I can go as far as saying that the term class fantasy can be interpreted as another stage of bringing the player and not the class. It sounds weird, but think of it this way. Debuffs still exist, but they're personal. They're balanced for the individual, not necessarily the team. They're powerful, and they'll make a big difference in a raid's overall performance even though one player's abilities don't affect others. Buffs still exist in a much more active form, but for what is lost in exchange, is it worth it? Is it objectively good or bad? I'm not sure, but at least in my opinion, I wouldn't call this approach a dumbing down, necessarily. It's too simple of a statement for such a broad topic. It's a lot more complicated than some think. I mean, notice that the only thing that I've talked about today were buffs and debuffs. There's so much back and forth out there trying to simplify the conversation with memes, talking points, and other repeatable phrases that I've got to wonder who's doing the dumbing down. And that's it for today. Remember that pretty much everything that I said is based off of opinion, so if you're up for disagreeing with me, feel free in the comment below so we can open up some more perspectives, hopefully without sounding like asses. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this piece, like and sub because it's cheaper than therapy, and I'll see you guys Wednesday for whatever it is that I'm going to do. I'm Soul. Stay breezy, guys.